Hi, welcome to episode 4 of Our Body, the podcast. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about redeveloping trust and love in others after trauma, because this is obviously a very difficult thing to process, and more often than not, the abuser or the person who has sexually violated you is in fact someone that you know. And 2/3 of sexual assaults cases are committed by a known person to the survivor. So this could be a friend, it could be a family member, it could be their partner. In my case, it was a family member, which made everything a lot more difficult for me to process, because in any kind of situation, you'd never expect that out of people you're supposed to feel safe around. Conventionally, you're supposed to feel safe around your family, you're supposed to feel safe around your friends, you're supposed to feel safe around your partner. And so putting them in this narrative that they've now become an abuser or a sexual predator becomes a lot harder to process, and that leads into a whole set of complex emotions after the assault has happened, because admittedly it's a lot harder to trust people, because you almost think, well, if I'm not safe around someone that I thought I would be safe around, then who can I be safe around, you know? And sometimes this can also bring out emotions of anger or resentment. And as always, I will be drawing from my own experiences, but I'm sure a lot of other survivors would feel or be in a similar situation. But for me, this happened to, or the person who did this to me was a family member, but he lives in Philippines, and I don't go to Philippines often, so it was harder for me to come back from that holiday, which was supposed to be a nice family holiday, but it was a lot harder for me to come back and then love my family. If, as harsh as that sounds, I found it very difficult to love my family, and I was just constantly angry at home. And I think it comes from I was drawing from this emotion that I can't even be safe in my family home. And so I was just angry all the time. I would much rather be out with my friends or be out distracted than stuck in my house. And these were during the times when I hadn't told my mum what happened, because in some way I felt resentment towards her the most, because it was my half brother who did this to me, and so we share the same mum, and I just felt a lot of resentment towards her, simply because I couldn't direct that anger towards my abuser, purely because of distance, also because I couldn't stand to be in contact with him. So I deleted every kind of memory that we had on my phone, on Facebook, which is where we would have usually communicated before. And so because I couldn't physically lash out and confront who actually did this to me, I was spewing that out on the people closest to me, which, isn't their fault. But it took a while for me to learn how to re-love my family and learn how to trust people around me again. And it wasn't that I felt unsafe in my own home in terms of my parents or my sister doing anything at all remotely close to something as traumatic as sexual assault or sexual abuse. But I think it was more so feeling unsafe because I wasn't so sure if I could trust them or fully love them if I felt like at that point I didn't love myself at all. And I think this can be quite a common experience for people who have been abused by people they know, but especially family members, because I think that makes things a lot more difficult to accept and a lot more difficult to process. And I remember when I was speaking to my first therapist about, what had happened and stuff, when I was sort of relaying back what had actually happened, I would always say or refer to him as my brother, because of course that was just kind of the natural attachment that I had towards him, because all my life he was my brother. Until she told me that it would be best if I disconnected myself from that attachment, and so I don't call him my brother anymore. I call him by his name. And I felt like that was kind of the point where because I had disconnected him from my family, I was able to then begin the process of loving my actual family again. I found it the hardest to redevelop that bond with my mum again, because like I said, my abuser and I both have the same mum, and so it put her, when I eventually told her what had happened and who did this to me, it put her in a very difficult position, because we're both her children and I can't expect her to act in a certain way to accommodate for my feelings. And I think that was a very hard pill for me to swallow, because if it was up to me, I would want her to disown him. I would want her to just leave him for the streets and completely disregard his existence. But of course, I also need to understand that just as this was a traumatic experience for me, it's equally or just as traumatic for her, because, like I said, we're both her children. And so I also had to develop some patience and some understanding of how she was processing my experience and how she was dealing and coping with the aftermath of it. And that took a while for me to kind of truly understand. And in some ways, I'll be completely honest and completely blunt, in some ways I still sometimes will have those feelings of resentment rise up again in certain situations, or if I start to have a lot of these negative thoughts kind of creeping back in, those same feelings of resentment will also start to creep back in. But it just, I've kind of learnt how to self-soothe, and I've given myself my own space, and that I feel was the most important thing for me in learning how to, in that process of developing trust and love again to the people closest to me. The most important thing to me was my personal space, because if I felt like I was being trapped or suffocated in their presence, I would mentally withdraw, I would emotionally withdraw from being around them, and that wouldn't help the progression of our relationship again, and that wouldn't progress more positive emotions when being around them. And so, you know, what helped was me being able to communicate that if I was having a bad day, you know, I communicated what I needed. So this meant I needed to be left alone for a little bit. I needed to not be spoken to if I was, you know, having a bad day or having a bad morning or just a bad episode, because it would only kind of fuel my anger again. And so that was very important in setting boundaries and communicating to my mum especially how she could best help me in those times. And, you know, during the first lockdown, so last year, we were obviously all very stuck inside our houses for the first time, and it was quite difficult for me to constantly be around my family. And I didn't realise how much it was affecting me until the second time that I had therapy, which was more like mid-summer, I'd say, mid towards the end kind of summer. And all those feelings that I had kind of bottled up in a way had begun to resurface as I spoke to my therapist again. In regards to my mum and my family, I would then create more time for myself in terms of having time to clear my mental health. And for me, the best way for me to do this was literally by, like, I would go to the park and cycle around. I would literally do this most days, because obviously things weren't open back then. But I would just go around Hyde Park and literally cycle around, and I'd have music in my ears, and I found that very soothing, and it helped me calm down a lot more when I was back at home and when I would be around my family, because I wasn't like storing up all of that energy. I wasn't storing up all of those thoughts. And so in creating self-soothing techniques for myself, and finding which one helped me best, allowed me to release some of the pressure. And so it meant then that I was able to come home and not be full of anger, and actually work on improving my relationships with my family and my friends. Now, this feeling of someone breaking your trust isn't always just from who the abuser was, because sometimes, or in some cases, it is someone that you don't know, and it can be a complete stranger. And so you don't have that expectation to trust that person, or have them, or develop distrust towards that person, because essentially you didn't know them to begin with. And so sometimes this feeling of broken trust in someone can come after disclosing your trauma. And this may be because they responded or reacted in a way that you hadn't expected them to. So it may be that they doubt your story. It may be that they immediately ask what you were wearing. It may be that they minimize your trauma in some way, or they may completely disregard your trauma and tell you to get over yourself. And and when you get an unhelpful response like that, it can really affect how you begin your recovery, because I've spoken about this in other episodes, but sometimes when someone begins to instill that doubt in your own experience, you can start to manifest those same thoughts, which leads to a lot of insecurities and a lot of anxiety over your own truth. And it's important that in these sort of scenarios, when you do get an unhelpful response, it's important to remind yourself that not everyone will respond to you in the same way, because some people just, the same way us as survivors process our emotions differently, so do other people. Some people will respond to hearing about trauma differently. So yeah, it's important to remind yourself that not everyone is understanding or has the understanding about sexual trauma. For example, when I told my mum and when I told my friend, my best friend, who was the first person that I told, they gave me the most loving response, and the response you as a survivor of sexual trauma would want and would expect of someone that you trust after disclosing your trauma to them. But sometimes, it might just be because they don't have that understanding of what it's like to go through sexual trauma, because they haven't gone through it themselves, and so sometimes they don't know what questions are okay and not okay to ask. Like, for example, there was one incident I remember when my sister had asked me, why didn't I fight back? And in my head, that question was processed as, why did I let it happen? That one question triggered me into such a depressive state where I really focused on self-blame. I realised I should explain to her why this question offends me and why it's not okay to ask those questions, and so that she knows for next time, whether it's in relation to me or someone else who discloses trauma to her, she knows that it can offend someone or it can trigger someone into an emotional state when questions that are directed to the individual or questions that are directed to the survivor can be framed in the survivor's mind as self-blame. So, like I said, in that kind of situation, I gave myself my own personal space. I withdrew myself from that situation. But by the end of it, I realised that rather than distancing myself from her even more because of that one comment that she had made, I would educate her on, like I said, why this was offensive and why it wasn't okay to ask me that question and how it triggered me into that emotional state. I think when you're disclosing or thinking about disclosing your trauma to someone, it's important to make sure that you're in a safe space, a space where you feel completely safe. And this may be your room, this may be your living room, this may be your, your boyfriend's house, your girlfriend's house, but it's important to be in a safe space so that if someone gives you an unhelpful response or a triggering response, then you can practice self-soothing techniques that are able to ground you again. Now, what I mean by grounding you is just sometimes when you get triggered into an emotional state, this triggers a lot of thoughts running over and over and over again in your head. And so sometimes those thoughts can lead into placing yourself in a harmful situation. And so it's important to have these techniques where you're able to ground yourself and, release and calm down your anxieties and your thoughts, most importantly. So I remember that my therapist had given me like breathing exercises, or I had to think of like a safe space in my mind, so that if I had to close my eyes for a little bit, for example, and just picture this image in my head. And for me, it was picturing the ocean and this colour blue that I find quite serene and peaceful. And so that is one of my self-soothing techniques. The other would be to focus on a particular sound. So again, closing your eyes and focusing in on a particular sound. So it could be the sound of a ticking clock, it could be the sound of cars passing by, it could be the sound of, I don't know, like this kind of sound. So you could tap onto something and focus on that sound, and those can help ground you again. What may also help is just speaking to a professional, like a therapist or a counsellor, or those helplines, which I try and leave them in the description box. So if you ever are in need of a helpline, most of them I think would be 24/7, so you can always call them and help ground you. If, like I said, you're ever in a situation where a response triggers you. I think from all this, the most kind of important thing to remember when trying to process these complex emotions is patience. Like I said, there's been times, even until now, where those feelings of resentment and those feelings of distrust can sometimes resurface, and sometimes they're involuntary. So I'll often flinch sometimes when something sudden happens, like a sudden movement happens. I find myself flinching, which frustrates me, and sometimes it happens around my family. I remember there was an instance where my sister and I were sleeping on the sofa, and it was exactly a year that I had been abused, and it was on that specific day. And so I was quite sensitive anyway, but I had fallen asleep on the sofa, and I was laying this way and she was sitting on by my feet, and so my feet were resting on her, and I think all of a sudden she had just moved my leg as she was getting up, and that literally made me jump out of my sleep, because that sensation of someone just touching me, again, it was just an involuntary response. And so, like I said, sometimes I'll flinch, and that will be around friends, that will be around family, but it's just about being patient with yourself and being able to read your own signs and create your own boundaries, even around your family and friends. So, like I said, you should be able to tell them when you need your personal space. You should be able to tell them when too much love or too much affection is triggering some kind of response, and understanding that these are complex emotions to develop, because trust and love are emotions that happen over time. It's not just you meet up with someone one day and you trust them with your whole life all of a sudden. So the same way it built up, that trust and love built up as a response to being around your friends and around your family, it's going to take that same effort of rebuilding it again after trauma. And so that's why I say it's very important to be patient with yourself and be patient with other people too, and being able to educate them on your boundaries and being able to direct them into creating a safe situation or a safe space for you where you're able to completely be vulnerable enough around them to feel that trust and to feel that love for them and for yourself. But yeah, I think that is mainly it for this video. I think most of it was mainly just me drawing from my own experiences and drawing on how I rebuilt or am rebuilding, present tense, because it's still a work in process. Like I said, there's still times when I get certain thoughts or I start to feel resentment, but I'm able to now be in a mental state where I can ground myself and when I can self-soothe, so that I'm not harbouring those negative emotions towards my family and my friends and, you know, people that I'm close with. So I hope that, not even that this was educational, because like I said, I was mainly drawing from my own experiences, but I hope that these podcast episodes are insightful in the way that they're able to give you a brief look into the mind of someone who has survived sexual trauma. Because for those who have gone through sexual trauma, there isn't a framework, there isn't, you know, the perfect journey or the perfect way to heal, and it's never going to be a linear process. And so as a survivor, it's equally as important to be able to recognise the differences as well as the similarities, but mainly the differences in responses to sexual trauma, so that you're able to better understand yourself and your own responses. But most importantly, for the people who haven't gone through sexual trauma, who may still respond in certain ways that are unhelpful when someone has disclosed their trauma to you, or if you're genuinely just curious about these kind of topics. But yeah, like I said, I hope these are helping someone in some way, and I am creating a documentary which will be coming out in May, right? In May this year, about sexual trauma, about surviving sexual trauma, and I'm really hoping that creates some kind of emotional response as you're watching it. That is all for this episode. I will see you all in my next one. Bye.